I work with Christian Aid in the Angola program, and I'd like to thank all of you. It was really interesting. And it's not exactly a question, or it may be, but I was also wondering about the importance of personal transformation. We support a program by the YWCA Angola, and they work with very young girls during one school year in a competencies for life development program. So it's not only skills, it's developing the knowledge about yourself, identity, the others, relationships, projects, economics around families, social and cultural factors, and then also HIV and health and reproduction, everything. And the results are amazing, mostly because these young girls learn to say yes to themselves, not to say no to HIV or no to sex or whatever. And because they have that transformative power in their own lives, even with all the limitations, they organize themselves and they speak with their families and they speak with churches and they are actors of change in their communities. And I think that's a way forward, although this doesn't mean that the political, social, economic, cultural aspects should not be addressed also from all of us, from everywhere.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions and then we'll come back to the panellists. So somebody over there, yeah?
Hi, my name's Justina, and I'm working with the Foundation of Women's Health Research and Development, Forward. We're an African women's-led organisation, and we've been talking a lot this morning about how to make contraception more accessible. And my question is, how do we actually make it more culturally accessible? And we've spoken a lot about the use of the condom, and fundamentally, the condom was created for a demographic and a people group who wanted to engage in procreative sex, and we're now using that specifically across the African continent in communities where actually procreation is really important and vital. And the issue Forward's done a lot of work in Sierra Leone, looking at child marriage and that's influence on teenage pregnancy. And the issue that we have found is that very often when girls do go to use contraception, the stigma associated to that is that they are loose women and they are prostitutes, and then they become a lot more vulnerable to rape and sexual violence. So we need to find a way to find some form of contraception that works within these specific cultures and communities that they can then be adopted and used by the people we're trying to work with.
Thank you. Is anybody else from this side? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Paul Harvey. I'm the director of the SLRC. I had sort of 2 plugs and a question. On transactional sex, do also read Taylor Horst, our DRC SLRC partner, who's done a fascinating report on transactional sex in DRC. On masculinities, our partner in Afghanistan, independently from SLRC, has done some really interesting work on masculinities in Afghanistan. And the question was, if we have time, it'd be fascinating to have a couple of minutes on your Pakistan work, Shanila.
Yes.
It was a shame to miss it.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll stop there because there are 3 quite wide questions. One around personal transformation and the importance of that. One around how do we make contraception more culturally acceptable, and then one looking at masculinity and transactional sex. So I don't know if anyone would... So you had a specific question referred to you. Do you want to say something?
Okay. The question was around sharing some work that I do in Pakistan. So I'll talk about 2 projects, and maybe they can also address some of Justine's concern, although I don't focus on maternal health, but I've tried to take up some of those culturally relevant concerns to rethink development practice a little bit. So as an academic, I often, as an academic and a practitioner, I focus on 2 areas: human rights in relation to girls, men, and development, and then also teacher education. So one of the projects that we did was as a young, to some extent naive, I was chatting with Rachel earlier, as a naive development practitioner, We received some funding from a U.S. university and did a human rights education camp for girls in Pakistan in 3 different semi-rural cities and villages, and essentially took up the standard human rights education curriculum that you can imagine, that looks at universal declarations of human rights, that talks about the body in particular ways, that talks about relationships in specific ways. And we did this amazing camp in Pakistan, which was fairly successful. For those of you who are interested, we actually also produced a text where students actually wrote some of the materials at the end of the camp. But then after that, I started reflecting on the idioms of human rights and the ways in which we think about the human in some of the in detached terms that actually do not circulate in the very communities where I worked. And so much of my thinking post that intervention has been around rethinking our conceptions of human such that we're thinking more about relationships and embeddedness in land. I was working in villages, agrarian communities, where the conception of human was it traversed living and non-living beings. And it was very interesting to think about being a human and having a meaningful life that engages in thinking about relationships and just not myself and my own self-interest and my accumulation of wealth, but it's more than that. And so I've been thinking about excavating different idioms of a good life, different idioms of justice that already circulate in Pakistan, drawing on local knowledges. And that takes me to the second project, which was teacher education project that I did last summer or the summer before. With the Aga Khan Education Services. And there too, what we tried to do was to think about doing teacher development differently. So instead of taking up models that we may learn in the global north and then introducing and transferring them onto local communities, we generated different models based on teachers' own knowledges on the ground. What would work for them? What are some of the ways in which we can think about justice? How can we think about rights? How can we engage with histories of colonization, which are very palpable in places like Pakistan. And we talk about them in everyday conversations. They emerge in these offline chats, but then how do we engage with thinking about the legacies of that in everyday living and in everyday experiences of poverty? And so it doesn't really address, Justine, your question, because I'm sure there are more well-suited people, but what I've tried to do is to think about decolonization as a framework, to draw on some of the work that scholars are doing in excavating and repairing, and excavating local knowledges and then repairing some ways in which we've been doing work in the communities. And it kind of speaks to some of the work you are doing too. So,
Thank you very much, Julia. Does anybody else would like to respond? Sinead?
Yeah, just to chip in on the contraception question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there are big sort of issues, sort of discomfort issues around condom use, and certainly in Sierra Leone and Liberia, from what I've seen, that the demand is really for injections, and 3-year, 5-year. Longer term injections, and they're extremely popular. However, condoms are the only thing to prevent STDs and HIV. So I don't have the answer to your question. I wish I did. And I think another issue, apart from the methodology, that would be really interesting is the actual reach, because we are using a lot of sort of traditional sort of health system based ways to reach people, and maybe your organization or others have had better luck being a bit more creative. Thanks.
Lisa, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I might also just pick up on the condom or the contraception use generally. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but we definitely also came across this sense of people didn't want to access contraception because of the stigma associated with it. And it really, for us, spoke to the issues of privacy and confidentiality, so that people felt that, a lot of the interventions would set up a space, say, in a health clinic that was meant to be this adolescent-friendly room where it was meant to be private and confidential. But, in villages, when you're a teenage girl and you walk up to the peripheral health unit as it is in Sierra Leone, which might be, however far from your village, it's not very confidential. And then at the clinic, you have people who work there who are friends of your parents or related to your parents. And so, we heard of girls actually going to nurses, like going to their houses, basically to their back door to get things sort of surreptitiously. And so there are real issues there with actually providing genuine privacy and confidentiality to enable girls to actually be able to feel that they can access those sorts of things. On the issue about the personal transformation, I mean, it sounds actually similar to some of the life skills training that went on, that really focused as well on cognitive thinking and on how to deal with emotions and all this sort of thing. And one of the really good things in Sierra Leone is that training has now been homogenized always sounds like a bad word, but in this case I mean a good word, but it's been made consistent across. So previously all the NGOs had their own sort of life skills training programs, whereas now actually under the Ministry of Education, is that right? Yeah. There's one curriculum that has been developed that is signed off by the government that then NGOs can roll out. And I think that's a really good thing. The only other issue that I think comes in that influences how effective that is your trainers. And there's often a train the trainers approach to delivering these sorts of things. And in some of the other work we've done previously on malnutrition in Sierra Leone, which uses that approach, you end up having a kind of Chinese whispers effect where the things that are meant to be said at the beginning don't quite match up with the things that are said at the end. And so it, again, goes back to this issue of the messengers of these messages that you're promoting. But yeah, that sounds very interesting. We should look into as well.
Okay, some more questions, yes.
Hi.
You need the microphone, sorry.
Hi, my name is Sabina Garbarino. I'm with Adam Smith International, working on female economic empowerment. One thing that has come up quite a bit in all your presentations was like structural obstacles, and there was mention of social norms. One thing I'd particularly be interested in is your experience of the sustainability issues around supporting those kind of change around social norms. Because I think we see a lot of emerging evidence, but some of that is very local, very community-based and limited in geographical reach. Or then there's like buying up airtime through media, by donors and so on. And I'm just wondering how we can make some of these things a little bit more sustainable when the donor leaves, when the NGO leaves and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Tina.
Hello, Tina Wallace. I'm attached to Lady Margaret Hall at the International Gender Studies Unit. I'm really pleased to see this gathering, and it's good we're looking at this question, but some of us have been asking this question for a large number of years, many people in this room, I'm sure. We've worked on gender issues for 35 plus years. And I think if these programs had consulted any of the literature or the experience, they would know that just focusing on girls was going nowhere. But my question is then, why has this happened? How did this happen? Some of it is rooted in new players coming into development who claim that academics and NGOs working on gender have failed. So they're starting again with new programs and new approaches. Some of it I know is about the need for quick results and quick wins. But going to your really interesting presentation, what is driving this focus on instrumental approaches with no power analysis, no real understanding of context, or race, class, etc., etc. I don't understand how this moment of complete change of direction actually happened when there was no evidence to base it on.
Thank you. One more question from this end here.
Good afternoon. My name is Cardi Jane. I'm from an organization called Sierra Leone Development Initiatives. I'm the founder and CEO. I'm very pleased with what has been discussed here, the panel has been discussing and sharing with us, because I'm originally from Sierra Leone, so I know the issues that are going on. And that's what compelled me to form this organization in the first place. I was compelled in 2014 to conduct a research independently, because as Lisa and Sinead, you maybe you're well aware, it's sex. Everything is sex, and prostitution has evolved as well, because now we have school-going kids getting into prostitution, and everybody's seeing that, everybody's talking about it, but nobody's doing anything about it. I have a teenager, and I felt really saddened about what's happening in our country, because if there is no appropriate intervention, it's going to be a crisis worse than Uganda. Because according to my findings, when we conducted the research, a significant number of the kids they are not even aware of condoms. And we had some interventions as well, because some of the respondents we had to take to the hospital, because some of them came in very ill, and I employed a nurse to take them to the hospital, and some of them were proved to be HIV positive. So it's like giving extra, without using condoms. So that's why I appreciate, is it Nico? Sorry, what you're doing, because it's good to engage men as well, because it's their attitudes. It's their attitudes towards sex, trying to buy sex all the time. And it's no longer like the prostitutes. It's among school-going kids as well. So it's really important for intervention to.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take one more online question here, and then we'll come back to the panel. So Megan Kinsey at Cambridge Education would like to ask Lisa in particular about the skills training in Sierra Leone. What does it include exactly? And if it includes sexual health education, what's the government's stance on this? So that's a specific question for you. So we've got a range of we've got structural obstacles. We've got Tina's question about, why has this focus on girls happened and why haven't we learnt? And then we've got your observation from Sierra Leone as well. So I don't know who would like to start. Natko, perhaps you'd like to start.
Sure. So I don't want to talk about Promunda as the best organization in the world, and I've been working in Promunda for 1 year, but one thing which I like about it very much is that it doesn't change its focus. So since 97 now it's been working on the issue of engaging men, and it's looking for diverse funding for the same line of work. And this is not the easiest thing to do in an environment where from time to time there are some topics which are hot and which are very popular, and then there's a lot of competition for funds, even with the decrease of quality. And what we see then is that we see programs working on positive masculinity, which I already mentioned previously, even at the cost of developing programs which are gender exploitative, whether gender transformative. Talking about contraception, I've seen programs saying, talking to men or communicating to men, you are the one that needs to take care of the condom, which is so wrong, because although short term it might contribute to more men using the condoms, in the long term it's actually deepening the inequality between men and women and exploiting the difference in the power. So basically, in the long term, causing more harm than damage. So in programming, but also in funding, we need to assure that there is a transformative approach, which includes long-term interventions, which includes parallel work on different levels, and which definitely tackles social norms and is very sensitive that we are not in no way exploiting inequalities and are not just sensitive to inequalities. So, for instance, assure infrastructural access to the contraception because of the situation of the social norms, because it is shameful to use the condoms, but also in the parallel work with the groups of men, where I'm sure in any community, out of the 10 men, you will have 5, 6, 7 men who are very positive in their views and which with their influence can assure that those that have negative views change their opinion and are influenced, and then we achieve the social norm. So yeah, basically that's, I think, wrapping up all the questions in one answer.
Sinead or Rachel, do either of you want to come back on any of those questions?
Maybe
We'll go to Lisa.
Lisa first,
Okay,
and then I might.
yeah.
Yes, Sinead probably is a bit more up to date with me on the life skills training in terms of what it includes on sexual and reproductive health. So I'm not sure what the final agreed version includes because that was still ongoing when I was there. But also I can put, this is weird that I feel like I'm talking to the person online down the camera. I can put you in touch with somebody who could tell you if you want to drop me an email. But previously, one of the challenges has been, I think, that a lot of the life skills training has been saying, there's been sort of two messages. First, don't have sex. If you do have sex, use a condom. Or use, some form of family planning. And the problem is that message is very confusing for girls because they sort of think because they're not meant to be having sex, they sort of don't want to admit that they are to do the second part of the message. And so it's been a little bit conflictual. Did you want to add to that, Sinead? You might.
Well, no, just to say that we can certainly share, as you said, Lisa, there has been lots and lots of back and forth about the final version, and that's one of the problems with having, something that's, sort of government stamp on it, and that's going to be sort of rolled out across all the schools. But Irish Aid has been funding this for years, so we're certainly happy to share the current version and the final version when it comes out.
So to address Tina's concern, as an academic, I will first say that I think, yes, definitely academics focusing on gender have been talking about this for decades. I think the idea might be that as academics, maybe we need to partake in public scholarship a bit more. I do see a trend in digital humanities in recent years. I think academics like myself, we have to actually just get out there. We have to start talking in languages that are perhaps more accessible and start writing in public fora in order to actually make our analysis circulate more widely than perhaps it has been. The second, it's a tough question in terms of how did we get here? I think one of the things I also feel is that in general, even outside of the focus on gender, we are perhaps in a moment that Wendy Brown describes as a reduction of individuals and social projects to economic metrics, right? So we are in an era where you are measured by the contribution that you can make to the GDP. You are primarily seen as either a consumer or a potential entrepreneur. You're seen as a worker. You are valuable only insofar as you can translate your life into these economic metrics. And I think when operating in this kind of environment, the language of investment that Nikki talked about earlier, it becomes possible to then say that girls are the ideal target because educating each girl will result in X numbers of dollars for the economy, including themselves and their families, but it also makes a contribution broadly. And then in this space, it doesn't, issues of race, issues of Islamophobia, issues of sexuality that are harder to then translate into dollars, perhaps don't get picked up. And I'm speculating. I haven't done research on why. But I think, but as all of us here agreed that these are critical issues around racialization that also have to be addressed. So maybe those are the two things, which is why we might be here.
Nikki, could I add one thing on that, if that's okay? I think, and I should say this doesn't come from our research, this is really just my personal view, but I think it's been interesting that under Conservative governments in both Australia, where I'm from, and the UK, you've seen this rise of the gender agenda. And to me, I think it's an easy add-on when it's simply about empowering women or girls and just, as if only we just made them like men, then everything would be fine, without actually having to interrogate the structural problems that underlay not just gender inequality, but class inequality and all kinds of other inequalities. So there's a little bit of me that while it's great that gender is now, a big deal for UK and Australian governments, there's part of me that's nervous about the way in which it's come to the agenda.
Can I just jump in and add one thing to that? Which I think gets to both of these points, which is that the sustainability question, because I think that need for quantification of results, to name the elephant in the room, also certainly comes out in the aid programming that gets funded, and it's how much of a difference did we make in the lives of these girls in this village in this 6-month or 2-year period, whatever it might be. And what we're talking about is social change that happens on a much longer time scale, right? So we can't measure the actual impacts of girls' education, and what a girl might have picked up in a program or in school, or, the boys might pick up in a program or in school that we give them now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when they get married and interact differently with their spouse, because no one's going back and measuring that. And so there aren't people going and saying, oh, that works so well, let's go fund it. But I think in many ways, it's that very slow education and the things that are much harder to measure that are actually going to make the much bigger impact.
Almost out of time. I'm going to take one question from here, and I'm sorry, Justina, you already asked one, but do come and talk to people afterwards. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you everyone for your contributions today. Very, very interesting. My name is Emily Coates. I work in the Sustainability Department of PwC. We have an expanding women's empowerment department there, which I manage. And I have a question which brings us right back to the beginning, which is delivering change beyond investing in girls. What do we mean by girls? When do girls become women? And how sustainable is this in that context?
Not even going to be able to answer all the online, get all the online ones, but Ellie Kennedy from IPPF would like to ask the panel, what role do you think international advocacy and campaigning can have in addressing these issues beyond securing funding for gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights related programming? And then Ashlyn would like to ask Sinead how quality might be measured or assessed in the development of successful education responses for adolescent girls in fragile states, especially within complex emergencies such as Ebola. So what I'm going to ask you to do is see if you can answer some of those quite difficult questions, and at the same time give us a kind of final comment from each of the speakers about what we've been discussing today. I'm hoping that we'll be continuing this discussion over lunch and much longer, but so do answer any of the questions you want to answer, and then make a final comment or a final thought. Let's start with Sinead.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question about how you measure the quality of education in fragile states. I mean, this was one of the things that we really struggled with this, getting pregnant girls into the formal education system, was that it didn't address the quality of education in the formal education system. It's not like that was some sort of mecca, and that still is hugely challenged, even on the limited kind of international metrics that we have at the moment on sort of literacy and numeracy, very basic things. The Sierra Leone education system doesn't get on very well. But I'm afraid I'm not an education specialist, so I hesitate to say more. Maybe others can chip in. Just on the question from on how international advocacy and campaigning can contribute, I suppose the first thing that strikes me is actually one thing they can potentially do is know when not to intervene, because one of the things we struggle with at the country level is some of these issues becoming framed as, sort of Western driven, kind of, coming in and imposing on our culture and so on and so forth. And so, on all of these issues, including female genital mutilation, we always have to have a very careful discussion with international groups and sort of international kind of media and so on. And I don't want to say there isn't a role, there absolutely is a role, but I think it's about the extent to which those groups really talk to the people on the ground and kind of time things right and phrase things right, and sometimes don't say anything at all. So I would just sort of say whatever the contribution is, please do engage very regularly and in depth with the sort of leaders of those those advocacy issues on the ground. And maybe my last point, because I didn't get a chance to say, I mean, Tina, I think you know very well the answer to your question. And if people read Tina's last book, which I would recommend, is it The Perfect Storm? Perfect Storm. It's great. And talks a lot about sort of gender and these bigger issues. And I think people have touched on it. It's the American dream. It's maybe the in the UK it has its own kind of kind of conception as well. It's how those larger political projects have translated into results-based management. It's the massive turnover that we have in the sector, and how we just, I think, I don't know who used the phrase, the continuity of discontinuity in the sector. I mean, it's absolutely enormous, and I think all of these things, contribute to why we're having some of the same conversations that we had, 10 and 20 and in some cases 35 years ago. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, Rachel and Lisa, do you want to?
I can start. And I mean, I'm basically just going to mention very briefly your question about when girls become women. I mean, it's a very complicated question. And I think one of the things we really struggled with, mostly around transactional sex, was this issue of, and it kind of picks up on your comment, Sinead, about the innocence of girls, right? That on the one hand, there is this sense of wanting to protect them from what is, in some cases, definitely exploitative and coercive. And at the same time, there is girls' agency and girls choosing certain options as ways to access resources. And finding the balance between that is really hard. And we talked about it a lot, and we don't have any answers to give you. But I think recognizing that that is a continuing tension is probably the best we can do.
Rachel?
Is this the chance for final thought as well? Do you want to add anything on that front? Okay. Well, it just strikes me that in another way we have to get a lot more basic in terms of programming that takes place, and that gets to the advocacy question in particular, because I think that a lot of what we can do and what people like us can do actually has a lot more to do with looking at ourselves and figuring out doing power analysis on where we're starting from. And I really appreciated that Shanila started with her positionality, because we, I think, often start with this place of we know what's best, we know what works, we know what girls need. I always think of I think it's a Gloria Steinem quote that power cannot be given, it can only be taken. And when we talk about empowerment, who am I to talk about what power girls in Sierra Leone need? And this really came out in our research as well, because hopefully part of the life skills training that's being adopted there has to do just with teaching critical thinking to girls and boys, which, I'm in my 30s, I have a lot of friends with very small children, and watching them hang out with their 1-year-olds and teaching them how to answer questions, and the critical thinking that we get without thinking about it, for a lot of us, is not something that necessarily happens everywhere. And I think starting at this very basic level of how do you teach little kids to answer questions, to imagine different possibilities, is really key. And we can start by looking at the programs that our own countries are promoting, and are those things that have a very set curriculum, and that are the things we think people need to learn, or is it how to think? Natko spoke about this as well. Is it widening people's options and understanding of how to examine their own situations, and then perhaps how to change them?
Natko, any answers to the questions or final comments?
So when thinking about engaging men, I first want to make a distinction between men's right and human's right organization, because very often we have a perception as soon as we're engaging men, we're talking about men's rights movement, which is something very much different than struggling for human rights and gender equality. But if we have a trend in funding which opens space for, let's just prioritize on positive masculinity, then we open space for lack of expertise and lack of transformative approach in working with men, and that opens space to perception of engaging men as a men's right approach instead of human rights approach. So we need to be very sensitive to that. And other thing which I would say is also very importantly, not thinking about engaging men as a solution, but of course just as a part of a solution, not thinking about as engaging men as, okay, so far we've been doing this, so let's take a part of what we've been doing or finances for what we've been doing and then invest it in engaging men, and that will create a solution. Obviously what we have been doing or what has been done so far has not achieved the change that we desire, so the solution is not taking away resources from that, but rather adding on the resources, and part of adding those resources needs to be also engaging men, but never thinking of it as a substitution, but as an enabling factor and as a piece of a puzzle for achieving greater social justice and all the benefits for the communities that we work with.
Thank you.
So I have two final thoughts, and I'm going to try to address Emily's question and the structural change question as well. The first would be development practitioners, policymakers or not. I think all of us have a role to play in holding our own governments accountable for the kinds of interventions that they undertake in the Global South. From the perspective of Pakistan, for example, the Let Girl Learns USAID campaign, for example, is going to be led by the daughter of the Prime Minister, whose name appears in the Panama Papers for actually partaking in money laundering, right? So I think there are contradictions in the work we do, in our posturing and in the political will. And I think that's where the contradictions lie when we think about structural change as well, right? I think there has to be change in political and financial institutions. And I think that then might create circumstances and the constraints within which girls enact their agency. I think if we move things around, then more possibilities will be available for girls. And we won't have to, I mean, of course, we will all need employment, but I think there's also this place of creating those changes so that more choices become available. And the second idea would be that now that we have had conversations around thinking about race, class, religion, nation. I think it is important to attend to intersectionality when we're thinking about gender issues, right? Gender in development has to then take up these issues and to, from my perspective, be attentive to intersections.
Thank you very much. So we've had the most fascinating discussion. I know we could have gone on for a long time, and as I said, I hope we've gone over lunch. Just picking up a few small things, really. I guess Sinead's about talking about things that make us uncomfortable. We don't like doing that. Sometimes I think that includes all the intersectionality work too. We need to continue to talk about things that make us uncomfortable and not shy away from them. A number of questions, really. So how do we move beyond the language and the kind of concept of investment and economic metrics? How do we make it a more holistic approach that takes account of individuals, communities, and all the different people within those communities, as well as looking at a structural approach which works with institutions, which works with and challenges governments? I think we've had some really interesting examples of both specific projects and ideas and very much broader historical perspectives that you've given us as well. And I think, again, we need both of those. We need to be rooted in history as well as to kind of be rooted in the here and now. And I think that also leads to the kind of questions that we're left with. So why aren't we working more with men and boys? What are the challenges of working with men and boys? Natco's point about that we don't want to take away resources from working with women and girls, but we want to have an add-on. And I think importantly, actually, often it's seen as a kind of contrast. Either you work with girls or you work with young men. Actually, we need to work with both in a kind of holistic, gendered perspectives that uses that structural lens that we've been talking about to take both genders into account and not just one. And then Tina's point about why has this focus on girls happened and where can we go from here? You know, how can we improve the way that we work and the way that we see the work that we're doing? I think for me, this workshop's brought both sides of two things that I really care about together, so the work with girls and the work that Promundo in particular and others are doing on men and boys. So I really hope that it starts a fruitful discussion, that we continue it beyond this room, and that we think about ways that we can do this work better. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to ODI for hosting and to all our panellists. So see you later.